Watch this. No way!
Hello and welcome back to the Cookie Jar Golf Podcast. I am Tom Mills and today I'm joined by Sam Williams.
Hello.
Carl Wing.
Hello.
And Sir Bruce Fitzpatrick.
Hello.
Hi, Bruce.
As always, you can get in touch with us on @Cookie Jar Golf on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And don't forget to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. It tends to help us out. So just drop us a review on there if you can. Today, we've got a really interesting one for you. We're following on our theme of architecture that we covered with Harry Cloak on Wednesday. So we're going to drop one about the history of golf architecture, starting right back at the beginning, and we're going to try and bring it to modern day and tie it all together. So
we should probably tell our listeners we are very much amateur architecture enthusiasts, if there is such a term. So, I mean, certainly from my point of view, I've always appreciated it, but never really understood it. So I've quite enjoyed actually going away and researching it and kind of perhaps becoming a little bit more woke on the topic.
Yeah, it's been good to research it and study it in a little bit more detail, isn't it? I mean, it's such a huge topic. I mean, just the period I was looking at alone, I felt I could have spent days on it. So it'll be interesting to chat about it and learn more from you guys.
We're going to make sure we get a professional in who knows what he's talking about. So
yeah, and he can give whoever's dropped the biggest clangers a nice dressing down and probably a bit of, bit of a sort of a public hanging really for that individual. So it'll be interesting to see how the next hour shakes out, won't it?
Yeah, after our last couple of episodes, which have been pretty light and full of a fair bit of ribbing, I think we're gonna try and be a bit more polite to one another in this, aren't we, Sam?
I'm going to try my best. No promise.
We're going to be studious academics of the game rather than clickbait stirrers of the pot.
So how's this going to work then, Tom? We're going to flip through the eras, right? We've each picked one era.
yeah, I think we managed to separate this up into 4 categories. We've got sort of pre-golden era, post-war, and modern day, which we've all taken a little bit of a look at. Who do you think's got it easiest? I think golden era's got it easiest, haven't they?
It's actually golden age, so you've already dropped your first clanger there.
Well,
but,
I think they're both. I've heard referred to both there, actually, Bruce. So I think golden era, just to irritate him further, is you've got to do that topic justice. I didn't want it for the simple fact that I thought if I don't do this thing justice, I'm going to have a lot of kind of highbrow golf architecture fans on the blower, and my name will be mud. I quite happily took the post-war era because I thought, well, such little is said about it that maybe I can shed some light on it.
I think the modern's probably the hardest.
Mills has got about 500 years worth to get through. So I guess on a purely, years count, number of years to be covered, Mills has probably got it the toughest out of the 4 of us, hasn't he?
Well, I'm gonna be kicking things off with the pre-golden era. And
take us back.
I mean, so first of all, I've got to give credit where credit's due, and Neil Laird runs a website called ScottishGolfHistory.org. I urge you to check it out if you're inclined. It's a fascinating view on how the game of golf started and how it modified over the years, and the origin of the first courses, and it's some really good stuff in there. Just things like where the words came from, like bogey. Quite an interesting one where that term sort of came from, and all the other bits and bobs where how the word golf originated is in there. So if you fancy having a look at that, you can find it out.
Is it Dutch originally from the game they played in Holland on frozen rivers?
Oh, so you didn't actually read where the terms bogey and golf came from.
So when you started talking about the etymology of the word golf, and I've said, is it to do with the guys in Holland playing on frozen rivers and through doorways called kolf, spelt with a C? You then said, I don't know, I didn't read the article. It's just on there if you want. So am I guessing that the next 5 or 10 minutes is essentially a transcript from Neil Laird's website that you're going to take us through?
No.
It's start to a rigorous academic examination, isn't it, of golf architecture. There's a great website out there. I haven't actually read it, but feel free to go and check it out.
Okay. No, there is what I read on there, because there is this sort of urban myth that it's gentlemen only, ladies forbidden, and that is categorically not the case.
Absolute horseshit.
It's generally accepted the word golf is derived from the old meaning club. I didn't really go into the mad depth on it, but it's certainly not that bullshit about gentlemen only. But mine is, because the golf architecture really kicked off in the 20s, a lot of mine is to do with history. So it's very difficult to separate the history of the game and how the golf architecture kind of really started. And I really focused in on old Tom Morris, really, and what happened around his life. But before we delve into that, there were, at the time of old Tom Morris, only 13 rules of golf. Anyone hazard a guess at what they were?
You teed up within a certain distance from where you hole out?
That's the first one. So there were no teeing boxes back in the day. So
were there even holes? Because the old course has still got quite a few interesting, like, stones basically out on the course that they used to play to. They're now covered. They're typically covered up with some sort of astro plasticky kind of thing at the moment, just so that you don't get crazy ricochets while you're playing the old course. But am I right in thinking they used to actually play to stones rather than holes in the ground?
I think also rabbit burrows as well, weren't they?
As far as my research goes, they were all holes. They weren't always flags. So sometimes the caddy had to go stand at the hole and they would shoot balls at him. So the caddy would go ahead and stand where the flag would be.
Oh, right.
And they would they whack balls towards him. So they weren't always flags, but they were holes. And weirdly, they weren't tee boxes. So the rule was, once you hold out on whatever hole you're on, you had to tee off to the next hole within 1 club length of the hole, which doesn't really work fantastically with agronomy. You know, if you're going to start doing your tee shots off the basically at the green.
Doesn't with my angle of attack anyway, coming in with a 5-iron or something.
Well, they didn't.
There wouldn't be enough seed to go around there, would there?
Interestingly, while we're at it, tee box comes from the fact that they didn't used to have wooden tees. They used to have a box full of sand, and they'd just sand it out, put it down. Caddies would put the ball on a sand, and they'd go again. So that was the sort of main one. I mean, there's a few rules knocking about with defining hazards, essentially, where you must hit your ball from if it goes in a hazard. There's a few of those bits and bobs. Well, my favorite rule was Rule 11, which I think is indicative of the time, really, which is if you draw your club in order to strike and proceed so far in the stroke as to be bringing down your club, then if your club shall break in any way, it is accounted as a stroke. So basically, if the club snapped mid-shot, that was a stroke. I mean, that's how shit the stuff they were dealing with was.
Anyone out there with a violent transition was doomed then for a bad score.
And graphite's quite a strong material as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's steel shot. But looking back into history is really interesting because we think we had it bad missing golf for 10 weeks. Golf started in the 15th century, and in 1457, King James II of Scotland, said that too many people were playing golf as opposed to practicing archery, which is what they should be doing. So he outlawed it for 45 years. So it was James II and James III. It was only James IV who was interested in golf that they allowed it back. So from 1457 to 1502, it was outlawed. So I think we did okay in 10 weeks.
Wow.
So I dialed in on old Tom Morris. So old Tom Morris was born in 1821. Born into relative poverty. He was born in St Andrews. Born into relative poverty. He played a lot of stick and ball games. You couldn't really call them golf, but it was kind of just stick and ball, knock it along. They had all sorts of names for it. But at the age of 14, he formally became the apprentice of Alan Robertson. Alan Robertson was the professional at St Andrews and is generally regarded as one of the world's first professional golfers. Back in the day, obviously it's a very different meaning than it is now, professional golfer. Like professional golfer back in the day would make a living from making belts and caddying and making balls and clubs and golf instruction, really. And Robertson at the time was the most famous of these professionals. And it's reputed that Robertson never lost a money game of golf in his life, in singles or foursome.
Because it was a huge gambling game, wasn't it? You know, very much in the first sort of, I suppose, right up to World War II, really. It was a massive money game.
It was a big game for the gentlemen, I want to talk about this in a minute, but the gentlemen versus professionals as well, because the gentlemen obviously used to be the members of the clubs.
Mm.
They would often wager on the pros who would go out and play, but it would be seen to be below them for them to play for money. So they just played. And it's hard to know whether the gentlemen were the better golfers or the pros were better golfers because they never competed in the same arenas at the time.
It's funny how that's still there, that amateurs can't take any prize money in today's game. And it's, I don't know, I mean, we'd have to check it out, but I do wonder if an amateur tennis player qualified for Wimbledon and won, whether the same rule stands. I suspect it probably does, but it's interesting how that kind of tradition sticks, isn't it?
In that sort of era, that Alan Robertson was generally regarded as the best golfer from 1843 onwards, including the Willie Park Senior and Junior and the Tom Morris Senior and Junior, even though that they ended up winning the Opens and things like that because the Open just didn't exist in Alan Robertson's time. So basically, Robertson ran the St Andrews links and golf making a business, and Morris served as his apprentice for old Tom Morris served as his apprentice for 4 years, and then 5 as a journeyman. So he just went out and played golf and made a whole ton of money, the two of them. And actually, Robertson was the first player to ever break 80 at St Andrews, which is quite interesting. Did it with a gutty ball, which is quite ironic, really, because it was in 1851 when Robertson caught old Tom Morris playing with a gutty ball, because Robertson used to have a big feathery ball business, and the feathery balls were really expensive for the time, and actually was one of the prohibitive factors of people being able to play golf. So Robertson was making a ton of money selling these feathery balls, and gutty balls came along, and they were really cheap, or a lot cheaper than the feathery balls to make. So when Robertson found out that old Tom Morris was playing with a gutty ball, he sacked him on the spot. And that was the end of those two. So it was quite ironic that Robertson then shot the first round under 80 with a gutty ball. But so the gutty ball is an interesting one. Do you guys know anything about it?
It basically made the game accessible, didn't it, for people? I mean, I'm sure I've read stories that, spectators, people would be out walking around. There was contraptions built for shoes so they could essentially sort of snare a little feathery ball. They're worth an absolute fortune if you got one of those back to the pub in the evening. And
really?
They'd change hands for quite a bit of money because they were really that was kind of your cost to entry in golf, was actually the ownership of a feathery ball, or they were expensive bits of kit. And then the gutty came along, and I think that then essentially meant that you could produce it at low cost, and therefore made the game, I suppose, for the first time, very accessible to anyone, really. Clearly you'd have to fashion clubs, and the professional of the day would make the golf clubs, wouldn't they, for the local players? But it was always the golf ball that was kind of the barrier.
So when they part ways, when Robertson and basically sacked old Tom Morris on the spot, Morris was left without a job, and he got picked up by this fledgling golf club, and this is where the architecture bit starts to start, really, which was Prestwick, which is on the other side of the country. So old Tom Morris went across to Prestwick, which was just starting up, and at Prestwick he designed, laid out, and maintained the course, as well as running his own golf equipment business, selling the gutties that he's came to love, and clubs, and giving instruction to players. And it was the original 12-hole Prestwick, which he designed, that was 3,799 yards for 12 holes, and the first hole was 578. It's like the course in one hole. A monster.
Obscene history at Prestwick, isn't there, when you think about it? Any of you guys played there?
I've not, no.
No, need to do that.
Cool, very cool track. Very quirky, really odd. But
great foursomes course, I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, lunch is off the charts. Great little spot for a beer afterwards. And the history, it's just absolutely oozing. It's kind of got a fairly similar feel, I think, to the old, in so much as the last, kind of the finishing holes kind of finish up in the town almost. And then the fence that takes you into the town. And yeah, I mean, it's a classy place, but it's really super quirky. It's not, all sorts of funny bounces and kind of, there's a lot of kind of blind shots, and it's just really, really bizarre place.
But apparently I've not been to Prestwick, but there's a stone that's around by the clubhouse at Prestwick that says, this is where the first shot was taken in the first Open by Old Tom Morris, and it's kind of on the side, and that's where they started it all.
And that was in 1860, wasn't it?
That was 1860, yeah. He started it along with James Farley, but he didn't win the first one, Old Tom Morris, but he did win the second one, and he won a further 3 times over the next 7 years. So he won 4 Opens. But his son, which is young Tom Morris, won his first Open at the age of 17 in 68. Wow. And then he won. So they used to play the Open for a belt. And they wrote into the constitution of the Open when it started that they basically thought that no golfer was good enough to win 3 on the bounce. So they said, if anyone ever wins 3 on the bounce, you get the belt in perpetuity, so you get it forever. And young Tom Morris, at the age of 17, won it 68, 69, and 1870. So he got the belt in perpetuity, which is quite an achievement. He actually won in 72 as well, but and there was no Open in 71, so he actually won 4 on the bounce, which is quite an achievement. He died at the age of 24, I think, of jury's out, but heartbreak, which is quite a sad story. His wife died in childbirth.
And then he just fell into sort of like poor health.
Yeah, like 2 months later, or something like that. It wasn't very long after at all. He died at the age of 24.
Oh wow!
But he was young. Tom Morris was considered like the absolute prodigy, the first sort of child prodigy golf. Before we move on from Prestwick, in 1882, which was loads of years after, Old Tom Morris actually went back to finish Prestwick as an 18-hole course, because in 1858, that was where the convention of 18 holes came in. So before that, it was there was 12. St Andrews used to have 22, and they had 4 short to start and 4 short to end, and they condensed both of them to 2 longer holes at the start and 2 longer holes at the end, and had 18-hole course. And because St Andrews had an 18-hole course, they made that the number of holes that any golf course should have.
So did they play 2 loops of 9 at Prestwick in 1860 then, or what was the?
Just played 12 holes.
They just played the 12 holes. Yeah.
Yeah, just played as a 12 hole thing. Yeah.
All right.
I mean, moving on to his design work. I mean, Morris played a role in designing courses across the whole of the British Isles, and the first thing he had to dabble with was Carnoustie, and that was with Alan Robertson, his mentor, I suppose. And they designed a 10-hole course at Carnoustie in 1842, and he'd later returned to that in 67 to turn that into an 18-hole course as well. I mean, one thing I would say, that not a single one of Old Tom Morris's courses exists anymore in its original form. Every single one that he's ever made has been adapted over time, which is quite a shame, really. And James Braid, in fact, renovated Carnoustie in 26. But Tom Morris has had his hand in designing Cruden Bay, Royal Dornoch, Kinghorn, Prestwick, Muirfield, the Jubilee, the Old, the New, Nairn, North Berwick West. What's North Berwick West famous for?
Redan.
Redan. I think he didn't design the Redan, though, unfortunately.
Is Askanish on there?
Askanish.
It features in my era later on.
You'll have to save it for later.
I'll tuck that in the back pocket.
Those courses, though, it's incredible, isn't it? When you look at the way they've stood the test of time, granted they've been polished and modified, but you go and show me any course that's literally untouched. I mean, there's very, very few, aren't there, really? And it's all done on site. It's all done on the basis of you've got this kind of plot of land that's, essentially fairly useless. You can't yield crops on it. Knock yourself out and build golf courses, walk the dunes, and just kind of do it purely through eye. And it's incredible skill, particularly when you go and play places like Dornoch and you think, people stood there 140 years ago, 150 years ago, and on pure sight just kind of routed holes through the landscape.
Oh, it's incredible. He got across. I mean, he didn't just finish in Scotland. He got across to Northern Ireland, Royal County Down. Then he went into the Republic of Ireland, did Lahinch. In England, he did Warkworth, Wolseley, Royal North Devon, and he did a couple of courses in the Isle of Man as well. I mean, the dude was genuinely a pioneer. And the last course he ever did before he died was the last 18-hole course before he died was Killamont in Glasgow.
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of that. Pretty much all the ones you've just named, I know all of them, but Killamont. I've never heard of.
Yeah, that's the last one he did.
Now, that's
But he
not
did-
saying that I should have done because I'm the resident expert. It's just bizarre, isn't it? Particularly considering it was his swan song for for
Well,
want of a better term.
I've handpicked a load of courses. He did 60 golf courses. So, I mean, there's going to be some you've probably not heard of, some that don't even exist anymore, I would have thought.
Got around a bit.
Yeah, well, there was no one really doing what he was doing at the time. That's the thing. I mean, he was seen as this leading golf professional, and because they didn't have architects or anything like that, he was just going out and saying, "Yeah, this is where I want it." And critics, we're going to talk about some of his critics in a minute, but some critics criticized the way that he did it and the way that he laid out courses, but there were sort of obvious drawbacks that he had available to him, I suppose, at the time.
Considering he was kind of setting the rules on this stuff, because he was really the pioneer. So everything then is an iteration after it rather than inventing the subject. What were kind of the things that he set out to achieve when designing a course? Because really all bets are off. He could have made every hole 1,000 yards, couldn't he, for example?
Well, so one of his critics is Tom Simpson later in life. And the three main problems that they said that he had was, first of all, that his holes were all roughly the same length. So they're all pretty much between 275 and 350 yards. Like everything he did was that.
Don't you get stepping on my golden age stuff?
I won't go stepping on your golden age stuff. They said that, that some of his layouts were overly geometric. So he was a fan of doing kind of square greens, probably due to the availability of equipment. You couldn't start doing really intricate sort of kidney-shaped design greens or anything like that because he didn't have the equipment to do that. I mean, they'd only just sort of worked out to cut grass. They needed to make an area that was easily maintained and go from there. So, and the other thing was the routings he used to use, which is to go back to your thing. I think being one of the first architects, that sort of trailblazer in golf architecture, he was just going to sites and saying, this is where the tee box is. This is where the green should be. This is where the tee box is. This is where the green should be. It was actually Tom Morris that invented, because we said earlier on, one of the first rules of golf was it had to be within a club length of the hole. It was actually Tom Morris that broke away from that and started making tee boxes at St Andrews to not damage the greens. That was accepted then as a worldwide thing. That was in 1875, where they started putting tee boxes in to not damage the greens. He didn't really, he was more of a routing guy, and like they said that his routines were really complex, and they did a lot of crossing over. But then he was born and raised and brought up in St Andrews, where there's a lot of crossing over on fairways. There's a lot of crossover between holes. So I think he just was going off what he knew, really. And it was Tom Morris himself that basically invented agronomy. When he went back to St Andrews, he was the first person to apply weeding on the greens, first person to apply top dressing in any way, shape or form, grass cutting and maintenance. He didn't really have any availability to move earth on a grand scale. So every time that he designed a course, it was kind of, what can I see? Where can I put the green? Where can I put the tee box? And we just kind of routed between it like that. So that's how he basically designed his courses. That's all he had to do.
Purely just following the shape of the land, I guess.
And in lots of ways, I think, I mean, I don't want to step on any of your boys' toes, but they perhaps went completely the other way later on, in time, where they had all this equipment where they could move land and do whatever they wanted. And actually probably wasn't to the benefit to the course in some ways. And just looking back at it and looking back at the lay of the land and thinking, just use what we've got.
Well, let's let the post-war golf architecture spokesperson cover that when we get to it, and we'll have time to provide a rebuttal on that topic, Tom.
But then moving on from that, I mean, old Tom Morris, his impact cannot be understated in golf, and with all the courses he designed, the everything else that he did. Donald Ross, who was obviously from Dornoch, in 1899, just before, so 9 years before he died, went to be an apprentice for old Tom Morris, and look what Donald Ross has given us. So, in 1903, finished at the R&A, and then in 1908, he passed away, which is ushering in the golden age of course design.
Fascinating and well researched there, Tom. I thought, like you say, didn't have all those courses. Amazing when you think of the impact he's had. You always just think he's the guy who essentially walked a plot of land and picked the routing. And the fact that he brought things like agronomy in, and you think of the legacy he had in terms of the game, the impact on things like early rule changes, is pretty pretty interesting to think where we'd be without some of those things happening 125 years ago.
Yeah, he's a professional, an architect, a club maker, obviously, a good player in his own right. But yeah, he was important in so many different aspects of the game. And yeah, I mean, I think you said it best there, Sam, when you said it's difficult to imagine where the sport of golf would be, and certainly the rules around the game and the format of how it's played would where that would all stand at the moment if it weren't for him. I think it was fascinating to hear about his changes to the format, or just the number of golf holes you have, moving or designing sort of purpose built tee boxes rather than teeing off greens. That's all that stuff is all new to me. So yeah, that was brilliant to hear, Tom.
All right, Bruce, do you want to kick off Golden Era?
Yeah, sure. So the first half of the 20th century witnessed a changing approach and what's been called the golden age of course architecture. There's some quibbling over the precise dates that the golden age could be said to last. From what I've read, and obviously I'd love to hear listeners' thoughts on this, and particularly people who are well versed or better versed in it than I am, I think it's probably appropriate to see the era really beginning in sort of pre-First World War Britain, and then coming to a close in the late 30s America and Australia, perhaps. So to begin with, just a brief word on the kind of wider social economic context which inspires some of these changes. There's not actually that much out there, but the Canadian writer and historian Keith Cutton talks about how, as Tom alluded to there, Victorian golf design was heavily influenced by the changes brought by mechanization and industrialization, and just this sort of overriding principles of geometric, fairly repetitive course layout. So, Tom mentioned old Tom Morris's critics later saying that a lot of holes were of pretty similar length, and the routing was sometimes quite uniform. The golden era kind of moves away from that, and Cutton thinks it's basically influenced by two things, really. It's the growing popularity of the game in the 19th century. More courses are being built, particularly inland. There are advances in rail travel, so a wider number of people are able to actually see the courses in Scotland, those Scottish links courses that Tom's mentioned there, and then go back and realise maybe where the inland courses that have been built are kind of falling short. And there's also this sort of arts and crafts movement, which Cutton talks about. It doesn't go into all that much detail on, but it's, in general terms, it's kind of people championing handmade goods and just sort of trends emerging in response to machine-assisted production. And Dr. Alistair Mackenzie is probably the best-known architect of this golden age era, because his work on what is considered to be the best golf courses to this day, such as Cypress Point, Augusta National, naturally attracts a lot of attention. But he also wrote down a number of his principles for course design in golf architecture and the spirit of St Andrews. So there's a bit more of a written record there than there is with some of the other architects. But I actually think it's probably appropriate to understand the context in which Mackenzie's working and the ideas that he's influenced by, and really to look at some of the early pioneers of the golden age, which aren't talked about as much. And from what I gathered, just reading up on this topic, I think the first one to look at is Willie Park Jr. So as Tom alluded to there, the Parks were pretty accomplished professionals in their own rights. Willie Park Sr., he won the first Open Championship played in 1860, ran a pretty successful club-making business. And then Willie Park Jr., his son, was also an accomplished pro. He won the Open in 1887 and 1889. And then in his mid-30s, he begins to wind down his playing career, and the growing popularity of the game presents opportunities for people to become club professionals and actually design inland courses. And Willie Park Jr. is one of the first people to do this. He ventures south and kind of takes some of that Scottish heritage and applies some of those principles at the turn of the century to two really important courses. The first is Sunningdale, which is completed in 1900, what is now known as the Old Course. And the second is Huntercombe, which is finished immediately after in 1901. And Sunningdale in particular is built on slightly more acidic, sandy soil of the Surrey-Berkshire sandbelt, which drains so well. And so Willie Park Jr. is able to sort of capture the emphasis on the ground game, undulations, contours that characterise those great Scottish links courses, but had maybe been lost in some of the sort of geometric, boring routing that had been taken to the inland courses in the preceding years. So Huntercombe and Sunningdale are both really well received, and there's an increased demand for Willie Park services all over, really. He goes out to Canada, he goes out to do work on Maidstone, I think, in Long Island, and influences a couple of other American architects. And what's interesting is just reading up on this period is how much overlap, not only in the places they worked and the courses they worked on, but just the different circles or the similar circles rather that they ran in. And someone who crosses over in some sense with Willie Park is Harry Colt, who's another prominent figure, but he probably doesn't receive the full credit that he deserves because he has a very impressive resume of courses. I think he individually designed about 150 and he contributed to over 300, which is just mind-blowing.
Churn and burn
in
Colt.
scale. Yeah. But he also, he has a great influence. I think a lot of people think he has a great influence over other architects, notably Alistair Mackenzie, Charles Allison, and Donald Ross. And Colt, he's born in 1869 in Highgate. He reads law at Cambridge, and it seems he'd go on and have a pretty successful career as a solicitor in London. But in 1894, an opportunity arises for him to design a course at Rye with the Scottish professional Douglas Rolland, and Colt then becomes the honorary secretary at Rye, where he refines the design there for 6 years and really catches the bug, I think, for a career in golf and working on course design. And he moves to Sunningdale in 1901 to become the club secretary, and he reworks some of Willie Park Jr.'s original layout. And he later designs the new course after the First World War. And then in 1907, the secretary at All Woodley Golf Club, Dr. Alistair Mackenzie, asks for a second opinion and a collaboration on the design there. Basically, he needs to, from what I gather, he needs to try and appease the committee at All Woodley that the design that he's laid out is decent. And obviously, Colt's the foremost architect of the period, so Mackenzie sort of enlists his support, and Colt, praises the design and maybe they refine bits of it, and they actually go on to become design partners for a brief time, along with Charles Allison. And the list of courses that Colt has worked on in the UK is simply staggering, but a few probably worth mentioning would be St George's Hill, which is designed in 1912, Burnham and Barrow that he significantly reworks, and many people consider that Colt has the sort of lasting influence on Burnham and Barrow as we see it today, and Swinley Forest, which is widely considered to be Colt's masterpiece. In the aftermath of the First World War, Colt kind of bucks the trend a little bit. A lot of UK architects, notably Mackenzie and Charles Allison, sort of follow lucrative design commissions over to the United States, but Colt doesn't really do that. He doesn't travel quite as much. One of the obvious exceptions would be the work he does to Pine Valley. He contributes to that with George Crump, and then he sees it through to completion after Crump's untimely death. But Colt, beyond that, I don't think Colt really travels as much as someone like Mackenzie does, which, it's kind of well known how he basically travels all over and fosters relationships with Alex Russell in Australia, and people on the West Coast in the United States and also in South America as well, I believe. So yeah, returning to Colt, I think in terms of his design principles, he's quite diverse. A lot of people who've played Colt courses would say that there don't seem to be any kind of trademarks or stylistic giveaways that really identify Colt's courses. But, in a way, what he really emphasizes is the need to give the golfer the impression that the course is a natural part of the terrain. And it kind of speaks to Tom Morris's emphasis on, working with the terrain rather than against it. And Colt, he wants to make sure there's par threes of differing lengths. He wants to avoid successive par fours of similar length and direction. And he kind of has more of an emphasis on strategy. And that might all sound quite abstract. So to try and give you a tangible example of what's meant by kind of reintroducing or emphasizing the need for strategic choice in golf course design, Woking Golf Club's a great example of this, because it's laid out by Tom Dunn in 1893 as a pretty functional golf course. There's this sort of idea that golf professionals kind of want to focus their efforts really on club making and ball making and that kind of stuff, and just basically provide a playing surface, and that's really it. So Woking's quite a sort of functional layout in that respect. And the fourth hole there measures just over 300 yards. There's a railway skirting up the right-hand side, and there's heather up the left. And it was probably one of the more generous fairways on the course. There was this idea that courses in the Victorian era should penalise weaker shots. And one day, John Lowe and the head greenkeeper at Woking, Stuart Patton, they take it upon themselves to just add 2 centerline bunkers based on the principles of nose bunkers on the 16th hole at St Andrews, actually, to this fourth hole at Woking. And as the green's protected by a bunker at the front left and the putting surface slopes from front left to back right, the addition of these centerline fairway bunkers about 220 yards from the tee by John Lowe and Stuart Patton basically pose the better player with a strategic choice. They can challenge the right fairway at the risk of going out of bounds, and if they pull it off, they'll have a much better angle to the green. Or they can bail up the left side, which is a safer route off the tee, but they're then faced with a much harder angle in, and it's going to be tougher to hold the green, particularly with the older equipment. And it seems pretty hard from what I gather to actually overstate how significant the impact of 2 centerline bunkers on a golf course on the outskirts of London really was for golf course architecture, because it attracts a number of architects at the time, and it was particularly influential on Tom Simpson, who's obviously quite near and dear to the four of us as the principal designer of our home track. And the story goes that Tom Simpson basically quits his job at a law firm after inspecting the fourth hole at Woking on a rainy day, and he later says that everything he learned about architecture and strategic principles of course design are based on John Lowe. He learns them from John Lowe. And Simpson's courses are filled with a combination of...
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Simpson's courses are filled with a combination of aesthetics, artistry, backed by sort of strategic choices. And he probably sums up his design ethos best when he says, it's only the mad masterpieces that remain in the memory. And the vital thing about a hole is it should either be more difficult than it looks or look more difficult than it is. So, Simpson and a lot of other golden age architects, they emphasize sort of angles, bends, undulations, gentle dog legs, bunkers set at different angles to the line of play. Some of them are markers, visual markers on a hole. Some of them are to sort of tempt the better player into finding a better angle into the tee. But it seems there's a relative degree of consensus among the likes of Simpson and Colt that you shouldn't really have bunkers within 200 yards of the tee box, except on a par 3 hole, because that would be unnecessarily penal for short hitters. It would almost be doubly penal because short hitters are typically weaker players, and so to punish them doubly for their skills would be harsh. Tom Simpson, he says a golf course should provide entertainment for every class of golfer, particularly the medium player and the long handicap man, who are the mainstay of the game. At the same time, it should provide a searching and difficult test for the powerful player, always provided he is prepared to take risks. And again, talking about sort of tangible principle of this kind of strategic emphasis, one of the things that Simpson's courses are probably quite well known for, along with the sort of lace edge bunkering, is that the center of the fairway, or the most direct line to the hole, should have some element of danger or risk reward to encourage that more powerful, that better player to hit shots that they're probably not used to.
It's funny about Simpson. It's funny about Simpson, isn't it? Because he obviously didn't want to punish the shorter hitter, but he was a big fan of punishing the slicer.
Yeah.
A lot of Simpson's bunkers are all on the right hand side. He didn't like a slice.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I'm conscious. I'll probably leave it there. I've been fairly UK centric in terms of looking at the beginnings of the golden age. Perhaps we could maybe talk about some CB McDonald, Seth Rayner, Tillinghast, and Donald Ross in the US, because I think from what I gather, we can maybe overstate the degree of consensus in golden age architecture. I mean, CB McDonald in some sense kind of goes back to some of the geometry and the emphasis on sort of straight line mowing and right angles that characterize Victorian courses. And apparently Chicago Golf Club is an exemplar of that approach. Seth Rayner as well, he's a sort of engineer by training, so he's a bit more practically minded, certainly in Tom Doak's view. But I think the overriding theme I'd take away from this is almost a spirit of collaboration, and just reading, some course bios over the last few days. It's been interesting to see how many of the sort of initial designs that were laid out around the turn of the 19th, 20th century were reworked and received input from a number of architects. Courses like Burnham and Barrow, Pine Valley is another. There's definitely a sort of spirit of collaboration amongst these architects, and Alistair Mackenzie, who's probably the most well known of the period. I kind of didn't cover him in too much detail for that reason. He lists a number of great principles, which I'd encourage anyone who's interested in architecture to go and have a look at online. You can access them online. They're formally documented in course architecture, in golf course architecture in the spirit of St Andrews. 13 principles that are all pretty easy to understand. Some of you might agree with, some you might not. But it's certainly been entertaining kind of reading about this and trying to understand and remember courses I've played with that emphasis on strategy and shot making in mind. So
I think it's fascinating.
I'll open it up to you guys.
Presentation, Bruce. I think the when you look at it, the whole concept of strategy in golf doesn't spring to mind straight away, because most sports typically sit around like executing a shot or being physically able to do something. And I think we all agree here that the golf courses that give you a mental workout as well as kind of put you to the test in terms of your skill and shot making abilities are the best. And it's just amazing when you think like kind of John Lowe at Woking won, a couple of bunkers, and then all of a sudden it's like a light bulb moment for course architecture. And yeah, just fascinating, really. And you can kind of see some of these different principles. The other thing I get when I kind of look at this stuff is you look back and you see the collection of individuals, and there clearly is a lot of kind of sharing best practice, and it almost feels like a bit of a little inner circle of specialists, but they all sort of feel like they had quite strong personalities and really different in terms of their approach, rather than just being, we'll come on to it, but maybe, ex-tour pro celebrity course designers who are all of similar sort of abilities and used to playing the same courses. These people were truly innovative in terms of wanting to bring, whether it was a more artistic flair, if you were a Simpson, or, your John Lowe's, where you're kind of bringing in as much kind of strategy into golf holes as you can, whether it's Mackenzie, who's got his own sort of certain signatures you'd see through the courses. It's just really, really interesting to kind of hear about, I think.
The funny thing about John Lowe is that him and it might even just be the greenkeeper, Stuart Patton, on his own, just goes out to the fourth hole and basically starts digging 2 holes for bunkers there, kind of without prior approval from the committee, which I think they're actually quite badly received. Initially people are saying, why are you putting these things in? But over time, I think people realize that, that the one of the real attractions of golf is that it's probably the only sport I can think of that isn't played on a uniform surface or uniform playing field. Like everything else out there is pretty regulated. And yeah, I mean, the sports psychologists have told these sort of, stories of, whenever they've had like a basketball team playing in a big game in a national final or an NBA final, whatever, they'll take the teams out there and they'll say, the court still measures this, the rim's still for X feet off the ground. And with golf, okay, you can have 18 tees and 18 greens, but the routes that you get there are very, very different. And it's just, there's so much you can do with it. And the imagination of the architects really does shine through on a lot of these courses.
One of the really interesting things I think about the golden age of course design is to think about things like sort of not the invention, but the bringing in of sort of course triangulation in terms of holes. And it's such a simple idea that you don't sort of play 3 holes in a straight line, because the way that the conditions can affect you playing golf, that if they sort of change direction, try and do things in terms of triangles, then actually you're with it or against it, or it's left and it's right, and every single hole will appear different. And it's so simple, really, when you think about it, but ingenious and long lasting in the long run, isn't it?
And that's, what's interesting about Mackenzie's work, Spirit of St Andrews. I mean, the first of, as you can guess by the title, obviously he thinks St Andrews in many ways not all, but in many ways, is the sort of model golf course because, as you talked about earlier in the week with Harry Cloak, like this idea that the better player can challenge the right-hand side of the fairways and they'll have better angles into the greens depending on pin placements. But by and large, the angles are always better from the right-hand side, but the bailout is pretty generous up the left. But having said that, the very first principle that Mackenzie writes down in The Spirit of St Andrews and Golf Architecture are the course, where possible, should be arranged in 2 loops of 9. I mean, it's very different to the courses that Tom Morris was laying out, and you look at St Andrews where it's 9 out and then 9 back. Mackenzie, and I think it seems a lot of other golden age architects fight against that, and they want to make it a bit more accessible. They want to make 2 loops of 9. They want a good proportion of par 3 holes as well. I mean, Mackenzie says he wants at least 4 one-shot holes on a golf course, which is something that our home club benefits from, and a lot of great courses that I think we've had the privilege of playing and have some fantastic par 3 holes. And yet you look at the sort of more, and without wanting to jump the gun, you look at some of the modern courses and the courses that they play on tour, they can be quite sort of regimented in the number of par 3s and the number of par 5s and that sort of stuff. So
that's why that era was so good, because they almost had a blank canvas, really. It was, they had the land to work with. Well, now moving on through, there's just, the land isn't quite there, and most of the work now seems to be sort of restoring that rather than having the ability to create new ones, really.
And the parting shot with all this, because I think it was interesting, the sort of what if, but Colt obviously passed up on that chance to go out to Melbourne and visit the course and do some of that redesign, and chucked it over to Mackenzie to do. And that put Mackenzie very much on a world stage. Obviously he went on to go and do things like Cypress Point. That inspired Bobby Jones to then use Mackenzie to go and build Augusta National. And it's just amazing when you think like the butterfly effect of, actually if Colt had fancied a bit of winter sun and could be asked to make the 3-month boat trip or whatever it was down to Australia, the world would be a very different place. So,
yeah, I mean, on that note, you look at Colt, like he'd been to the US and Canada prior to the First World War, and particularly with Toronto Golf Club and Hamilton Golf and Country Club, he helps launch effectively the career. He effectively launches the career of Stanley Thompson, who goes on to become and breaks out as this sort of the best architect that Canada's produced. And Colt also kind of leaves plans for Old Elm in Chicago in the capable hands of Donald Ross, who goes on to become a very sort of almost totemic figure in the world of golf course architecture. So part of it seems like Colt's happy to delegate and leave others to sort of finish his work. But yeah, I mean, you're spot on there, Sam. Like you look at the sort of designs that Mackenzie's been accredited with, he sort of stands as primus inter pares in that regard.
The other thing you mentioned is that about having more one-shot holes. I mean, one of the most interesting courses I've played in a long time is the Berkshire. And it's quite interesting that you'd have a course of the Berkshire that's got 6 par 3s, 6 par 4s, and 6 par 5s. And that's a Fowler design. I mean, he's obviously he's taken those principles and gone to an extreme with them. But it's weird that you don't see that, because there's no reason why you can't have 6 3s, 6 4s, 6 5s. But it was a fascinating round of golf when you play it, because it is so different.
Yeah. Well, variety wins, doesn't it? I mean, even our course, you never play the same par consecutively until you reach the 15th tee. And just the whole concept of variety, I think, brings a lot for...
Ashridge Golf Course, you never play the same par. It's quite interesting.
Really?
I'm gonna try and move us on to my topic, which won't be as interesting as a Golden Age, but I'm going to try and do it justice. But the last parting comment I wanted was just, you mentioned about Rye there, Bruce, and no, I'm not going to talk about your President's putter win in January, because I think that's had sufficient airtime on the Cookie Jar podcast. But it's strange.
I never wanted to talk about it.
That place is just synonymous with history, though. Like, your most eminent golf writer of the Golden Age, Bernard Darwin, I think was president there, wasn't he? And all kind of, it's just such a strange sequence of events, how that place almost feels like kind of Mecca in many ways for kind of English golf.
I mean, it's another place where 5 par 3s, 5 very challenging short holes, to par 68, which I think in the modern day it's almost like anything less than 72 is blasphemy, and I don't think Golden Age architects would have looked at it in that way. And certainly, people who know and love Rye think that it's just an incredible course, not only because of the history and how it brings together figures like Colt and Darwin, but there's so many great principles of course design that are still very much present at that course. And just to think that it's basically the first place that sort of piques Colt's interest, and given the influence he has on a succession of other architects like Mackenzie and so on. I mean, that in some sense is sort of the starting point. Well, it is the starting point of Colt's career. That's where he goes from being a solicitor, looking like he's going to follow his father's footsteps and become a successful solicitor and member of the sort of respectable upper class in London, to saying, well, no, I want to embark on a career in golf. And, that subsequently inspires a lot of other people to do a similar thing. So
take us on into the post-war era then, Sam. What goes on there?
Okay, so I don't need to tell you what happens between 1939 and 1945, but I do want to set a little bit of context. So post-war architecture in many circles is essentially 50 years in length. So you kind of start at 1945, and then your purists, or some people would argue that the modern era starts in 95, which is when Mike Kaiser bought the land at Sandhills and Core Crenshaw did the design work, and that opened for play. So just kind of setting context in 1945, 6 years, one of the biggest battles happening around the globe that has ever happened in our history. Pretty much all the resources in continental Europe and the US has been diverted to help manage the war effort. What does that mean? Pastimes like leisure and stuff, these things go in the bin. Even more so, golf courses are having to be used for other purposes. So, military bases, things of that nature. And also you've got a massive depletion of the skill sets. So, people who were studying golf course architecture, if you, and practicing it, some of the people from that golden age, the likelihood is when you get into a 6-year war like that, you know what, you come to the other side of it and probably the world looks very, very different. And you're not thinking, right now I'm desperate to get myself back up to, Liverpool and do some renovation work up there. I think the whole priorities for these people probably changed radically. To kind of set the scene for this era, I think there's 3 things that I would put into that 50 years that for me influence this more than anything. And I think it's very easy to sit here now and criticize golf course architecture and the designs and the product of those eras without fully understanding some of the wider facts that go around it. Because typically this is known as being the dark ages for the courses. So we strip away concepts of strategy. Courses become much more penal. It becomes much more an exercise in executing shots. Arguably things get more boring. But I'm going to kind of come on to that. So the 3 things I've got, anyone hazard a guess that things that happen after 1945 and through the sort of 50s, 60s and 70s that might have had a massive influence on the game?
Well, advance in technology.
Yeah, so
is that more towards the end of it, I guess?
So heavy machinery comes in partly at the end of the war, really, because you can now move earth at scale. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Typically, courses designed before had to be sympathetic to the natural land because you simply, short of carving out bunkers from, natural contours, you just couldn't create large dents in the land. So that's a huge thing. All of a sudden, there's capability there that never existed. Second thing,
TV's got to be one, isn't it?
TV is definitely one, Tom. So obviously you've got 70s and 80s. All of a sudden, golf's really, really accessible. So a lot of people are watching golf courses in America. They're watching professional events. What does that mean? More people want to play the game. So there's more demand for golf, which means we need more golf courses, okay? And then in case anyone's not got the third, the motor car. So the motor car is hugely influential, in my opinion. The 50s and 60s, private car ownership skyrockets. Now, historically, all the golden age courses, any course kind of pre-war, essentially, most of those typically, you even mentioned it, Bruce, like Woking, they're close to train and railway transit. And that's because that's how people used to get to golf. So now we've got the motor car, people can travel, they can move around. That gives opportunity to start looking at different plots of land. So I guess with all that, what I'm trying to say is technology that people don't know how to use, skill sets that don't necessarily exist in the same way they did before, and an increase in demand. I did find a few little pockets though. So there's a chap called Mackenzie Ross, who was probably one of the early post-war architects who is credited with restoring courses after the war effort. So Pyle and Kenvig, Castletown down in Channel Islands. He lived in North Berwick, and he actually worked with Tom Simpson pre-war. The biggest thing he was credited with was the restoration of Turnberry, so the Ailsa course, which was actually under concrete, or large parts of it, because that had been turned over to the RAF during the war effort. So kind of a bit of an unsung hero there. Starting to just talk then about what were the courses that were designed during the time. So when you do the reading, the stuff that's associated with it is this whole concept of hard par, easy bogey. Now, if you look at the different types of course design and hole design, you've essentially got strategic, heroic, and penal. And you talked a lot there, Bruce, about strategic because it gives players of all ability an option of how they play the hole. What happened in those kind of post-war years is more professionals were designing golf courses as opposed to your artisans like, Crump and Simpson and Colt and Mackenzie. These were kind of top-level players, and therefore the shift in their mindset is, do you know what? We should reward golfers based on shot-making ability. And therefore, the concept of strategy starts to drift away from holes. A lot of people talk about Bellerive has been a really kind of good example of this. So it's kind of narrow, pinching fairways. There's trouble on either side. You've got hazards coming at you left, right, and centre. And that kind of just reinforces it. Big designer from the era, so Robert Trent Jones. So he's credited with courses pretty much in every state in the US. He's designed stuff in 35 countries. Very much a through his family business with Rhys Jones and Robert Trent Jones Jr., a bit of a mouthful, tons and tons of golf courses. But I wanted to try and make this a little bit more UK-centric. So if you look at course rankings, and let's accept that course rankings are flawed and it's not the best way to determine good golf courses, but I was quite interested in saying, well, let's have a look at some of our counties. So in England, we've got 48 counties at the moment. There are approximately 1,900 golf courses. So that works out just shy of 40 courses per county. And I would say 60 to 70% of those, when you look at the numbers, were built post-1945. So if I just sort of have a little scan through, there was a couple of areas where I was just quite interested to see how prominent post-war architecture is in terms of those kind of, revered golf courses. So if I look at our own county, Worcestershire, so we would have to go all the way down to number 7th in Worcestershire, which would be Redditch Golf Club, which was designed and built by a chap called Frank Penning when Redditch moved there. And when I play that course, if any of our listeners have, absolutely on the money what we've talked about in terms of the design. Trouble down both sides. You've got internal out of bounds that sort of encroaches into play. And I just wanted to shoehorn that in there. But it does, again, just kind of reinforce the idea that you've got to hit the ball on a certain line to give yourself a certain shot into the green. There isn't a case of just pick the best routing for you. I wanted to also talk about Oxfordshire because I was trying to come away from Linksland because I didn't think that would be a fair competition, because if you look at the coastal areas, it's going to be dominated by kind of heavy links tracks. So let's take Oxfordshire. Now, the Oxfordshire is third ranked in the county of Oxford. Huntercombe and Frilford are ahead of it. Now, I just wanted to read out a little passage about the Oxfordshire, which just, I think, sums up the era really, really well. So the prolific golf course architect Rhys Jones designed the Oxfordshire, and the course opened for play in 1993 after significant earthworks. Jones is big in the States, has designed many courses, including Torrey Pines and Bethpage Black. The Oxfordshire is laid out on fairly flat and uninspiring land, built with an American style to extremely high specifications with sand-based greens and tees. Ostensibly, it's a tournament course with vantage points for spectators. It then talks about the Benson and Hedges International that was played there, etc., etc. We wouldn't recommend the back tees of 7,200 yards for the average golfer. talks more about kind of distance. There are well over 100 bunkers. If you are striking the ball well, you'll be okay. Otherwise, you'll find it a bit of a slog. Now, I just thought that kind of summed it up perfectly. I don't know what you guys think. Now,
Have you played the Oxfordshire?
Say again.
I played that.
You played the Oxfordshire?
I've not. No, I've not played it.
Some of it is like, I mean, it's like I hear what you say. It's an American track. Like it's some of it's like mutant water carry, and then like you've got a small landing zone, and then more mutant water carry, and it's like.
What does mutant water carry mean? Does that mean
You
you mean long
in the middle, but it's sort of built around, and it's just sort of wraps around it, and it's very quirky.
It's got some of it. If you go to, I think it's like the par. It's the whole 6, 7, 8, some of that. There's a par 3 that if you play it from the back pegs, it is to green at the back. That's all water carrying. It's got to be like 200 yards easy, and then it's just kind of a bowl at the back, and there's just It's a plot of land they seem to have shoehorned a lot of water into that perhaps didn't exist.
I think we'd call that penal.
Yeah, so and well, I mean, that's the thing. It's all heroic and penal stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that because you look at courses like Augusta, and they talk about Amon Corner as being one of the greatest stretcher holes because it incorporates strategic, heroic, and penal in quick succession.
Can we just drop a line on these things? We talk about these, but we never actually outlined what these things are: strategic, heroic.
I'll go into it if you want. I've covered that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll leave that to Cal. But essentially, what it's doing is it's making it very difficult for the higher handicap golfer to gain large amount of enjoyment because there's forced carries everywhere. And I think it all just comes back to there's a lot of machinery and there's a lot of equipment there that over that era people are kind of obsessed with using, but it doesn't actually add anything to it. And if you look back at the artisanship of the golden age stuff, yeah, it's not producing as good at golf courses. The counterpoint I try and make there at the beginning, though, is ultimately there's just a lot more demand for golf. And I think in '89, I've got a report here from the RNA that suggested we needed something like 900 courses to be built. And they pretty much built those in that decade. And that's just frightening when you think about that kind of volume across the UK.
Wow.
It doesn't feel like it's happening anymore.
Yeah, I mean, because you're trying to balance.
Scotland and Ireland seem okay, but the UK just feels a bit quiet.
Yeah, I mean...
England.
Sorry, England. Yeah.
Other notable mentions in here. So the other things I wanted to bring in. So 1977, the PGA decided to move their headquarters. Do you know where they moved it to?
The Belfry, isn't it?
The Belfry. So in the So they moved it to the Belfry. Peter Alice commissioned design. Now there are a couple of good holes on the Belfry, but they do encapsulate what we're talking about in terms of what you're going to discuss, Cal, in terms of heroic and penal routing. You look at 10 and 18, there's more carries there. So yes, you can either go for the green or you can choose to lay up on 10. 18 is an enormous amount of forced carries built into that, and that whole kind of garden experience of golf with large amounts of water and fountains and everything like that made a golf course really opulent. It was very, very different to what the Golden Age architects were building, Surrey Sandbelt and all that sort of stuff. Just changes massively. So I thought Belfry for me was that was the standout example of kind of British post-war golf architecture. I want to talk a little bit about Pete Dye, but he doesn't have huge influence over in the UK. He rather drew quite a bit of inspiration from trip to Scotland with his wife Alice, who he then took a lot of those concepts back over to places like Harbour Town, places like Kiowa, TPC Sawgrass, Whistling Straits, and use things like railroad sleepers in bunkers. He's obviously famous for holes like 17 at Sawgrass, which is, that's the ultimate penal golf hole. It's a complete forced carry. You must hit that green. Actually, the intention with that was never actually to build that as an island green. It was just as he started getting into the excavation work, the idea evolved. And whilst he didn't want to do it a second time, he did end up doing it a second time.
It was his wife's idea, wasn't it?
PGA West.
It was his wife's idea.
Yeah, I think so, because she kind of collaborated on a lot of the designs and stuff. So he's quite interesting because he comes through as someone who's really imaginative and really interesting, and you don't get that same kind of feedback around a lot of the other designs of the age, which was much more
equally, he's also known as, his designs are known as, he has that moniker of diabolical. It's just another diabolical golf course, not not reading that literally, but just saying that, he's forcing you to hit shots over water, and like the reality is if you're not a good golfer, you're just not going to have a good time.
Yeah, and
like,
go on.
That's just part of the game, isn't it? That's just the nature of the game. When you've got so much water involved and force carries, unless you're a competent golfer, you're not going to have a good time.
Swinging back to the Belfry just for a moment, though, the 18th of the Belfry, if you can't carry the ball 150 yards, it is genuinely impossible to play that hole.
You won't hole out.
You can't get off the tee, and then you can't get on the green.
So my counter with all of this would be, with the benefit of hindsight, and we're looking back now at 43 years since the Belfry was made, and the woke course architecture generation would sit here and say it's not what we like, right? There was a time where that was right, and there are a lot of people who still really enjoy playing the Belfry, and ultimately that's why we all play the game. And yes, there wasn't an amazingly high quality product produced in that area, but there was a lot. And the growth in the game is something that's massively celebrated, and we all want to see continue. So I think the whole era for me, if I was to sum it up, it was kind of function over art, really would be. It's kind of volume over quality. And that's where we are, really. And places like the Belfry have obviously become synonymous with things like the Ryder Cup and the emergence of the European team as a real strong competitive force in those match plays. And there's a huge amount of people wanting to go and play that because it's a course they've got to see and watch over the years. And there's a lot to be said for that as well. So I think that's my kind of argument for why courses are.
Just to follow up on that, Sam. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in that Oxfordshire little bio hit job that you did there. Do you think a sort of common feature as well with a lot of architects here is that they're trying to sort of structure or route the course in a way where they can accommodate like vast swaths of spectators, and actually that's pretty unappealing for the standard golfer who's just going to go and play that on a normal day without the sort of grandstands and paraphernalia scattered around
and housing. So all of a sudden this is a much more popular leisure thing. So back in your era, Bruce, when say like you were there in the 20s, but in your era people got on a train to go and play golf, and it was a game of gentlemen. And now you're dealing with a mass market game that's popular to all, and actually people want to live where they golf as well. So maybe not so much in the UK, but other countries, huge resorts as well, where very much the course is something that you put around the houses that you want people to buy, because that's
a destination, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And
you go to the Belfry, you can stay at the Belfry. I think there's a hotel at the Oxfordshire as well, and
it's resort court, and it's all geared up.
Resort golf, yeah.
Despite how close it is to all of us, I've never played there. Have you all played the Belfry?
I played the Brabazon. The Derby course is very interesting.
The other two just seem like you've got this course, and they think, oh, well, if we say we've got 2 courses, that sounds better. If we say we've got 3 courses, that sounds even better.
But it's catering for that audience, though, isn't it? And it's not there because no one wants to play it. You don't put 3 courses on a site because no one wants to play them. So the whole idea around this era for me is it's catering for a level of popularity in the game that we all love and we all celebrate and we want to see continue. Does it produce courses that all of us are waxing lyrical about? No. And I think that's where we get to. And then we almost, that's a bit of a segue and a tee up for you, Cal, because then it's almost now into this era of enlightenment, as much as I think there's still some continuation, but it kind of floors yours, Cal, to put your case forward.
Which and by all means, feel free to chip in where you like, but I guess this is sort of 95 onwards, the emergence of technology and sort of both the game, but also course design. And in some places, especially in England, as I mentioned earlier, it's potentially a lot of land has dried up and there aren't many courses being made. A lot of it, that sort of moved into the restoration side, which I will go into shortly. Firstly, the tour is one thing, and sort of mentioned technology and its main issues around the game and how it's almost become easier for pros at the moment due to technology and the ball, and everyone's a lot fitter. The ball is just going so far. It's sort of thinking, well, how the hell are we going to adapt the courses to suit? if this continues, are we going to sort of finally hit the 8,000-yard golf course? That might become a regular feature on tour. Who knows? We hope not.
What's the longest we're looking at the moment? Is it is Black the longest? Like 6.5, 7.
It feels like that, doesn't it?
There's some stuff out like Mission Hills and stuff, haven't you? Got things out there. And
the stuff in Japan that's just 8,000 par 6. Like genuinely, there's par 6s.
Slovakia's got a par 6, hasn't it? That's a reason.
But it's just gimmick, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, exactly.
But on tour, you got Bethpage, which is like 7.7, isn't it? Something around that.
Yeah, I mean they're all sort of every year on year. It's they all seem to be getting closer to that 8,000-yard mark, which is quite scary, really. And a lot of these top courses, and especially in the majors, and look at the US Opens, the Open, USPGA, even Augusta. They've sort of most of the top courses that are played regularly on a rota have reached their limit. Can't do it, so they've got to go down the other route of how do we protect the course? And okay, there might be an argument of going down the ball route and having to sort of scale that off, but that's that's probably up for debate another time. But
it's interesting actually. If you don't mind me just jumping in on that, because Simpson actually talks about advances around his time, and he says the game, this is actually a direct quote from him in Golf Monthly. I mean, who knew Golf Monthly was a reputable magazine at the turn of the century, given what it's become today. But next to a sort of Callaway advert, he said the game has been waging a battle against the inventor. The one aim of the inventor is to minimize the skill required by the game. And he was actually referring to the Haskell ball, which flew about 10% further, it was estimated, than the ball back in John Lowe's day. And Simpson basically says, I think John Lowe would be horrified as to, what inventors and technology have done. So it's funny that you see these issues crop up in cycles, as it were.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure, they're going to have to sort it out. There's no way it can continue, really. But I guess putting that aside, and that's assumed something is done with the ball, and it's sort of, we don't have to go down that road, then realistically, very few of us can actually bring golf courses to its knees. The average golfer, the amateur golfer, is I don't think we have to worry about, getting it to 8,000 yards for us. I think
I'm not bringing golf courses to their knees on a particularly frequent basis, I must admit.
Well, mate, if you get your iron play dialed in, you're usually pretty deadly, aren't you?
On the middle of the fade.
The wind only has to blow for us, and it's it becomes quite difficult. But that's it. Instead of just lengthening a course, it's all about protecting the course, whether that be hazard placement, narrowing fairways, runoffs, undulating greens, and really testing decision making whilst still providing enjoyment for amateurs and hopefully avoiding the pancake flat layouts, as sort of Sam dive into there. And I guess on that, sort of how can you adapt courses and everything else? So it probably goes back to three main theories that we touched on, which is penal, strategic, and heroic. Penal we touched on, a golf shot with no alternative routes, which could be a hazardous par 3 with carry, for example.
So the typical penal shot is the 17th at Sawgrass, isn't it? It's that's it.
Yeah,
binary. It's like do or don't.
Yeah. You may as well walk to the drop zone.
I might as well walk to the drop zone. Yeah. Is there a drop zone next to the green? Because I need that one.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, even that's pretty hard, isn't it? So probably a blob. Then we move on to strategic, which is very much different pathways around obstacles, which is much more like it. That's much more playable and gets the golfer thinking. How can they plot their way around? And heroic, well, that's, as Sam said, probably the 10th at the Belfry, that drivable par 4. It just teases you to go for it, but there still is an option of playing it safe with a 5-iron and hitting a wedge close. But the option's there. It provides entertainment. Whether that's obviously not on every course, probably more for the TPC Sawgrasses, the Belfries of the world, where they are there to provide entertainment. Are those three theories, those three terms, are they becoming outdated? Potentially, yeah.
You probably need a mix, don't you? I guess a lot of architects, it seems, regardless of what era you're looking at, with the exception of maybe Sam's era there, post-war, I think, well, I mean, just reading Mackenzie's stuff as well, I mean, he talks about there being a mixture, essentially, of those three themes. And, you know, by strategic, we're not meaning that anyone can play it. I think by strategy, it seems like Mackenzie's saying that, you know, the course can be arranged so that the weaker player will lose a stroke or a portion of a stroke, but they will have an alternative route open to them. And yet you do want some holes where there's like a heroic option as well. I think it's just striking that balance right, which it'd be interesting to know how modern courses have navigated that conundrum.
Yeah,
exactly.
That's where Augusta's a really good example on that. So it's kind of it's held up as the great example through Amen Corner, because if you think about the 11th, you've got very much its position off the tee, isn't it? In terms of that dictates the line in. So if you go too far down the left off the tee, you've got a forced carry over water, or you can make a bailout shot to the right where there's obviously the clear runoff. So that's very much kind of strategic. You move to the 12th, which is you have to hit that green. Short is dead, long is dead. So you have to hit that green, and that's very much a penal golf hole. You move to 13, which is a reachable par 5, and it entices, like you say, Cal, almost, you know, get your drive in play. How far can you get it up the gut of the fairway? And then actually, can you take a look at the green, or do you lay up? And that's where it's a heroic kind of example. So it is like, how do you use the variety? Whereas I think through certainly the era I talked about, it felt like, you know, kind of lent on one or two throughout and never, and there wasn't that,
There was no strategic. It was just penal and heroic, wasn't it?
I think actually, if you look back at things we've discussed before, like the Ryder Cup, in the way that Europe hosts the Ryder Cup, they tend to only pick penal hero courses. You know, courses like National and the Belfry, where you're forced carries and you've got to do penal, and it lends itself well to match play. I think penal hero golf courses does lend itself well for match play because it provides entertainment. But in terms of golf courses, for the people like you and I, just not so much fun to just get beaten up.
You've got an interesting era here, though, haven't you? Because you think, I mean, I laughed. We had a comment, we had a message sent to us. We were chatting with one of our listeners up in Liverpool who Celtic Manor came up in discussion. I think the term "that's where golf went to die" was used, and you've got that in 2010 at the same rate. At the same time, you've got unbelievable influence with, you know, we talk a lot about these places in America, but you've got equally magnificent renovation projects happening in the UK.
Oh, exactly.
You know, and
which leads me exactly onto that point. Is sort of going. I mean, that's where it seems to be really striving at the moment. I mean, but stick with the UK, for example. It's the renovation and the restoration work is sort of first class, and certainly seems to be going down that route at the moment. So a couple of names we see thrown out at the moment. Some of those we know very well. Frank Pont, who his work is massively inspired by Colton Simpson courses, which use a sort of combination of nature and strategy on and in courses. You know, with the theory of every hole and every green is different. Examples include Swinley Forest, New Zealand down in Surrey, our own Blackwell and sort of Royal Hague in Holland. They are very interesting, and it's great to see those courses sort of being preserved and restored, in some cases, as we know, back to original designs. And it's good to see those that aren't neglected. I'm sure you guys would agree.
Well, you got to look at the fact that it's a lot of these courses which are revered for being the best courses ever made. You know, were done in the 20s and 30s, and then you've got this entropy that goes on, that where all these golf courses over time are going to erode and they're going to wear away, and they're going to get worse. So they're going to need maintenance to be restored to their original thing. But then you've also got, which we haven't touched upon really, is death by committee. You know, like over the last 100 years, some of these courses are, you know, 125 years old, 140, 50 years old. You've got these people come in that they've been delivered with these glorious golf courses, and then with absolutely no background in course architecture whatsoever, say, okay, well, let's remove these bunkers because I don't like hitting the ball in that, and let's make these changes and these changes. And you end up with a product that has just been so far removed from the original designs. I mean, some of Colt's designs have just kind of faded away, and they've got some absolutely gorgeous golf courses time, there are now just non-entities. I mean,
Well, they're kind of
come back.
protected, aren't they, by like sort of almost. I mean, many green committees are almost like tree preservation societies now. They're almost, getting stuff removed is. I think there's some emotional connection to that as a topic, which makes it really difficult. And I played Walsall Golf Club last year, which is a Mackenzie design, and you can kind of really and it's a historic golf course. You can. It's a really good routing and a really good layout. But you also play it, and you can't help get the feeling that why have we got trees kind of encroaching into the fairway, so that when you play out to a position which is clearly where you've been directed to play to, I'm stood in the middle of the fairway and I haven't got a line to the green. And it's just simple things like that. Like, well, I don't know, clubs, there's that kind of constant friction, isn't there, in terms of what they want to do with their own renovation projects.
But it's finding its own footing as well. I think it's got to that time, as you say, where some of these lost classics are having to come back. And certainly the people financing a lot of these ideas have had to go there because there's not the land that there once was to design new ones. It's the way that, land values for residential make more sense than turning them into golf courses. That's just the way of the world now. Another one we touched on earlier was restoring old classics, such as a lot of old Tom's work, which you were saying, Tom, and that was sort of Martin Ebert at Askanish, who helped plot out old Tom's original design and getting the footprints back out there. And then on that same course, to sort of finish it off, Mike Kaiser came along with the idea. He's the money man. He came to finish it off and dragged Tom Doak over to put his final spin on it. And that is that's kicking off at the moment. And from what I've seen, just looks incredible.
It's certainly a thing at the moment now that golf course renovation is just like, it seems to be exploding. This sort of, the Cole Crenshaw, and the Dokes of this world, like they're starting to come back with some really fascinating designs. And I think the next 10 years is going to be a really interesting watch about what happens in terms of golf courses.
Well, exactly. Yeah, as you just mentioned there, sort of Bill Core, Ben Crenshaw, they're really doing things stateside. So I mean, they're heavily influenced by Donald Ross and Mackenzie, and again that
Sandhills. Am I right in thinking Sandhills was their sort of big breaks? Cal, that kind of. I know Sam mentioned it as a bit of a break point, but would you say that that's been quite a significant course in the sort of long sweep of course architecture?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, up in that region, Sandhills, Sheep Ranch, Bandon Trails, certainly done one course on Streamsong in Florida, Cabot Cliffs, and then their renovation work they've started at Pinehurst.
I think Sandhills was almost like that was almost like your Woking fourth hole moment, another one of those kind of scenarios, I think, Bruce, because it was, let's buy a plot of land that's absolutely insane and then build a world-class golf course on it. And it doesn't matter that it's not near any other civilization, or that we're not even interested in selling, condos and real estates around the course. This is that golf course.
No,
and that
pure golf.
And that was that massive shift, wasn't it? Yeah.
Which gets you on to the likes of Jill Hance, Tom Doak we mentioned, and David McClay Kidd. Now, Jill Hance, for example, he's very much into his textures and colours and likes to use a mix of plants and different kinds of grasses, and it's for pure, elegant beauty. So that's sort of his signature touch, if you like.
Pinehurst was a massive renovation, wasn't it?
So Pinehurst, number 4. Again, he's got his own course, Streamsong Black, over in Florida, which a lot of guys are sort of touching that part of the world now. But he's also done Les Bordes in France. So he's everywhere. But also
that'd be an interesting one, because I've heard Les Bordes. There's a story about Les Bordes. Apparently, if you go and play there off the back tees and break 80, your name goes up in the clubhouse on a leaderboard, which I think maybe leans more towards the penal side of things. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with a bit of variety, I guess, is there?
But as long as it's options, if they've got a back tee where they're saying don't go back there because you'll die, but then some normal visitor tees and you can play off, then that's fine, isn't it?
But again, some of his renovation work has included Trompe d'Oral, which I think he's tried to take it away from that sort of resort course, that stadium course, and just put a bit more excitement out there rather than bomber drive, wedge, just try and make it a little bit more strategic.
Say what you will about the big guy, but he's got some world-class courses under his portfolio, hasn't he, Trump?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that goes on to like Trump, Aberdeen, for example. I've heard incredible things at what he's done at Turnberry. As controversial as he might be, it's they are certainly works of art. And it goes on to sort of David McLeod-Kidd, who his own spin is, again, very much on creative strategy and having tight lines of attack, but also generous fairways at the same time and benign rough. So he wants the amateur to find the ball. Doesn't want to be penalised and lose a ball. It's still harsh, but fair.
Well, mate, it's just to tie a couple of these threads together. It's brilliant that you say that, because Mackenzie, one of his principles was that there should be, and this is reading it directly from Spirit of St Andrews, there should be a complete absence of the annoyance and irritation caused by the necessity of searching for lost golf balls.
Exactly.
Which is just exactly what you say there about generous fairways.
And then I certainly feel that McLeod-Kidd has gone on to that next era. So obviously UK-wise, he's done Castle Course at St Andrews, Queenwood, which is obviously very exclusive, but also Bandon Dunes in the States, which sort of leads me on to certainly a guy who's in the press a lot at the moment, and is certainly taking golf sort of away from its typical 18-hole layout, is Rob Collins. And his thing is it's all about the experience. And he's showing that great design can come in small packages, sort of really working with smaller plots of land and raising the artistic bar. The backyard renaissance, as it's known. And this is with his 9-hole layout over in Tennessee, which is he's done with Tag King over there. And it's just insane. How's a placement, and green contouring is off the charts, and it's purely just a very simple 9-hole loop, but it's on acid. It just looks incredible. Got a couple of tee placements, so there are 2 different loops you can do on the 9, but it's all about having fun, and it's by fun, whether he's turned a very flat piece of land into something completely different. Contours, undulations, huge amount of sand, which is now sort of shifting that focus onto the very renowned Buck Club, which we will see with great excitement where that's going to take us, really. And it's nice to see that see the emergence of the municipal, I feel, or certainly that effect of 9-hole course and all about having fun.
We've touched on it, haven't we? I think in a few pods, and it's a topic that keeps coming up, but it does feel like there's more changes, a different attitude around all this. You see it a lot through social media and the types of courses that now kind of get the airtime, and it's fascinating. Just looking back, hour and a half or hour, whatever we've been talking now, crazy when you think about the evolution of it all. I know we've kind of been talking as, complete amateurs on the subject who have absolutely no right to be broadcasting their views to listeners around course architecture. But it has been, I found it fascinating going off and researching it, but it also then tying it through in terms of where you started, Tom, with, old Tom Morrison, kind of the founding of the game, and actually just routing of a golf course right through to the concepts, how it's changed over time, how people have incorporated different viewpoints, how people have learned from others. And it almost feels like it's gone full circle from kind of a period of enlightenment into the dark ages, and now feels like we're back into that, whether maybe it's a bit too grandiose to say period of enlightenment, but it does feel like there's a new, if that's a thing.
I agree. Yeah. We're recapturing some of that old wisdom, the stuff that Rob Collins is doing, that Cal's touched on there, is a nice new change as well, and it's innovative as well as kind of recapturing some of the golden age wisdom, which I think we need to do in the modern era, and particularly make the game more accessible to people with busier schedules, and maybe make the barriers to entry a little, reduce them because they may have gotten too high in a lot of areas. So I think it's been a pretty cool tour to go on. And actually, I mean, I played up at our club yesterday, and I don't know about you guys if you've played since you've been doing this research, but it's just interesting to look at your course in a different way. And actually, maybe have some sort of logic or kind of tangible explanation that you can give as to why holes play well and why some maybe don't, and how you could improve some, and what trying to just get in the architect's head and be like, oh yeah, that is actually how I play this hole, or oh, I do tend to take this route over a different route that's also available. I just think it's been quite a cool personal enlightenment as well. Yeah.
But I think this whole period of research has been absolutely fascinating, and I hope you guys listening have enjoyed it. I mean, it does need a preface that we're all fairly newbies and trying to get this as much as we can. But thank you so much for listening and coming on board. If you do have any corrections, please get in touch and point the abuse at Sam. That'd be quite good if you could do that. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. Speak again soon.
Adios.
Watch
Thank you.
this.